What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're working on a 2013 B8.5 Audi S4. In front of me we have a South Bend Stage 2 clutch kit along with an OE LUK flywheel. These two pair great together, even though this is an upgraded clutch which is capable of 420 foot-pounds. So if you want to do a small tune or a pulley upgrade on your supercharger but still daily drive your car, this is a great alternative versus the OE or a Stage 3, which is going to be a little bit more rough for daily driving. The South Bend Stage 2 clutch includes a new throwout bearing, a clutch alignment tool, as well as the hardware needed to do this job. It does not include a flywheel that you're going to want to purchase separately. So we went ahead and went with the LUK. Typically, we recommend you replace these units in pairs if you can. Sometimes you can reuse your flywheels. What happens though is these dual masks cannot be resurfaced. They do have planetary gears inside of them that over time wear out. So whether you have a slipping clutch or a bad flywheel, if you can, just do both at the same time. As these get older, their back and forth gets a little bit longer and gets a little bit sloppier. So oftentimes if you're in stop and go traffic and you're letting off the clutch pedal and you feel it kind of like jerking a lot inside the vehicle, it's usually the flywheel bouncing back and forth on itself. And just like anything else, a clutch disc is always going to wear similar to brake pads over time. With normal use, they still last a pretty long time. If you smoke your clutch, not only are you going to smell it, but you're going to feel it too. The car RPMs are going to bounce up and down as you try to accelerate without going anywhere. To learn a little bit more about what a smoke clutch is, be sure to click the link in the description below where our very own Ben Romowski takes you into the sad world of smoking your clutch in your car. Moving on the table here, we have all the hardware needed to do this job. We have bell housing bolts, we have drive shaft bolts, as well as some hardware for the mounts that hold our transmission in our vehicle. We also have a new clutch fork. These don't typically go bad. There was a super session to do an upgraded clutch fork, which we're going to be installing today, as well as a couple other bits to our left here, which are not mandatory for this DIY, but we have transmission fluid as well as a fill plug and drain plug, so we can service the transmission while we have it up in the air. We also have new hardware for our exhaust, which we're going to be dropping in order to do this job. Other than that, before we get started, let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this job. For this DIY, you're going to want to whip out all the basic tools. In that, I mean torque wrenches that range from 1/2-inch drive all the way to 1/4-inch drive. Same thing for your ratchets and your extensions. You need about 3 feet worth of extensions, whether you're doing all 3/8 or 1/2-inch drive. We did a combination of both, along with a bunch of different adapters and swivel adapters as well. We have a bunch of ratcheting wrenches, which make this job a lot easier. A couple picks, a couple flathead screwdrivers. You're going to need Oetiker style clamps. We have some pliers that help remove some rivets that we encounter along the way. Again, your basic sockets. We have a large 36mm socket. This is going to come in handy when we undo the pilot bearing in our crank wheel. We also have electric tools to help with the removal and install of hardware. We have a small caliper gauge here. This is going to be needed when we preload the clutch and clutch module assembly. We have some ratchet straps that we're going to use hand in hand with the transmission jack, which is not pictured here. Speaking of items not pictured here, we will also be using a press as well as some pole jacks, which are to my left. These are going to come in handy when we're removing the exhaust and we want to raise and lower the transmission. You'll see a couple hammers and pry bars. I'm sure we're going to change these up as we go along the way. Two things I want to note, which are going to be pretty critical for this job, is you're going to need a couple 12-point sockets, and specifically an 18 and a 16mm. Those are going to come in handy for the bell housing bolts and the clutch module bolts. One thing I really want to note for the clutch module, you're going to need a really shallow 12-point 16mm socket. I actually modified this one ahead of time, as I know that the opening in there is very small to fit in with a torque wrench in order to torque those down properly. And something that helps spin the crank on this engine is CTA 1412. This tool goes hand in hand with a ratchet, so you can rotate the engine assembly as you do your clutch module bolts. Other than that, let's go ahead and get started with this DIY. All right, my good people, the very first thing we're going to do before we get started is we're going to disconnect the battery. We're going to go ahead and hop in the trunk, lift up our cover here. Next, we're going to go ahead and remove our spare wheel. The battery is located in the rear underneath the spare wheel. With that out, now we have this cover on top that protects the battery. You start by undoing the negative terminal first. It's going to be a 10 millimeter nut. You can use a wrench or a ratchet to undo that, and then we'll go ahead and undo the positive. Here's our negative undone. We can go ahead and just sneak that down there. Slide this cover over if you need to pop the positive terminal flap here. Same thing, 10 millimeter nut. You don't want to remove the nut all the way. These are just designed to be pinch bolt and nut setup. You don't have to actually undo the whole nut all the way back. There we go. With that, we can go ahead and leave this situated. I recommend you leave the trunk open so you don't lock yourself out of the back here. And with that, now let's go ahead and hop to the front of the car. All right, my good people, to get started, we're gonna start with removing the front wheels. Now, obviously, we are working on a lift today. There is no question that doing this job on the lift is gonna be a lot easier than doing it at home on the garage floor. But that's not to say that you cannot do this job at home. I've certainly done clutches on my back at home before, and while it's not fun, you can do it. So to get started, we're gonna remove our front wheels. There's a couple liner pieces we have to remove after that. So 5 17 millimeter lug bolts to get our wheel off. For those of you without a impact at home, I recommend you break the lug bolts free with the car on the ground still using a large breaker bar. Then once you lift it up, you can undo them the rest of the way. If you have an impact gun, if you don't have one, I highly suggest you get one. If you're gonna be an avid DIYer at home, just go ahead and zap these off and then we'll get our wheel off. All right, gang, moving into the wheel liner here, we have 2 10 millimeter nuts, one behind your brake line and one on the opposite side of the strut that hold this small cover in place. We're gonna go ahead and remove those next. I'm just gonna use a 10 millimeter socket and a long extension. And then with both of those off, we should be able to pull this cover off. And we can go ahead and set this to the side. With this cover off, we're gonna stop at this point on this side. I recommend you go ahead and hop over to the other side of the vehicle and do the exact same steps, and then we'll pick it up in just a moment. All right, my good people, next on our laundry list of things to do is gonna be to remove all the shielding underneath the S4 if your car still has it. Usually these are plastic. This car has been upgraded to a metal skid plate, and then we still have the standard cloth shield in the back. So the hardware may vary on your vehicle. As you can see, ours is a little bit mixed and it's missing a few. We have a couple Hex, a couple Torx, a couple Phillips holding this up. So we'll go ahead and drop this now. Then we'll move on to the back shield, drop that, and then go from there. 2 T30s up here, 2 T25s, one on either side. When you drop your shield, be sure to pull it towards you. Be mindful there could be a ton of debris on it. You don't want it falling on your face. Go ahead and set this to the side. Moving back, we have 3 T25s, at least left on this car, that hold this panel on, as well as 2 plastic rivets. We'll start with the rivets first, and we can just go ahead and set this panel to the side as well. I recommend you keep all the hardware with each shield and panel that you remove. That way when you put everything back together, you know what goes where. All right, my good people, next on our things to do here are we're gonna work on removing this lower cross brace. It's held in by 4 18 millimeter nuts, or bolts, I'm sorry, and 2 M14 bolts. Before we drop them, oftentimes there are lines or hydraulic lines or power steering lines, depending on what you have attached to these. In this case, we have our electrical lines that run to our electronic steering rack. So there's a couple zip ties holding them up against the X brace. We're gonna go ahead and remove those so we can get this free. On this side, it has an expanding rivet that just kind of pops through the X brace. You can just go ahead and usually pop these through using something flat or a small socket. And then up here, the line continues on through just a regular zip tie. We're gonna go ahead and cut that off. We can always zip tie it later, and that'll free up these 2 lines going to our rack. Now with that, that's undone. We can grab our 18 millimeter socket and just zap those 4 18s out, and then we'll do the 2 M14s up front. You do wanna replace these bolts. They are torque to yield bolts. Now we have 2 M14 triple square bolts up front to remove. Make sure you grab the brace so it doesn't fall on you. Same with these triple squares. These will be replaced as well. Also listed in the description below. All right, next we're gonna work on removing the 2 subframe shields. We have one on the driver's side, one on the passenger side. They're held in by 2 10 millimeter bolts and 1 13 millimeter bolt. So we'll start with the right side and we'll do the hardware on the outside first. On the right side of the subframe, you have 2 10 millimeter bolts. You can choose which one to drop. I'm gonna go ahead and just undo the one at the shield here. You can also undo the one at the subframe, but you don't need to do both. It's a 10 millimeter bolts. We have one more 10mm bolt underneath the wheel liner on the back side of the axles. And we have one more 13 up top here, which sits directly underneath the flex pipe and the down pipe on the headers here. And then once you have that 13 undone, it's just a matter of wrestling out the shields. You're going to want to pull them in towards the bottom of the car. Just like that. Be mindful when you have these shields off, now your subframe, the sides of it are exposed, meaning that the square nuts that hold the X-brace bolts in place can fall out. So you can either choose to leave them in the subframe and just be mindful of them, or you can go ahead and pull them out and set them with your X-brace. Whatever you like, just be sure that these are in here before you reinstall your shields. With that one out, let's go ahead and do the same thing on the driver's side, 2 10s and 1 13. All right, my good people, next on our list is going to be to remove the center section of the exhaust. So from the headers down, we have 3 what seem to be 11mm nuts. They're a little bit crusty, so the size could have changed over time. We have 3 nuts that we want to remove on either side. Following back, we'll get to some clamps, but I highly recommend you soak these in your favorite penetrant spray for a while. We've been soaking them for about an hour. So we're going to go ahead and try to undo them. The goal here is to not break the studs. You can press these out. There's just going to be a pain in the butt later on. So we're going to try to save the studs, remove the nuts, and go from there. We have new hardware for this as well, which is linked in the description below. So 3 11s on each side. We'll go ahead and work them out gently. All right, so at this point, I'm not even going to mess about with trying to get these off. The wrench is going to start to spin on the nuts and strip them out. So what I'm going to do next is grab a torch and just gently shooting away from the shaft here, the steering shaft, we're going to go ahead and just heat these up a little bit and see if that'll help break them free. So one moment while we grab the torch. All right, my good people, so as you just saw just a moment ago, we were wrestling with the upper 12mm nut on the driver's side bank of the exhaust. It was a bit stripped, so I had to use an extractor socket to get it out, a 12mm one with a 19mm wrench. That's the head size on this. I couldn't use a regular 3/8 drive ratchet. Didn't have enough room. So for now, this side is loose. We'll go ahead and shoot out that one stud that broke. And then we're going to go back and undo the 2 clamps that are completely rotted out on this car and swap those out too. Those were on the table. For now, we're going to leave the right pipe in place. And then we're just going to continue on the back of the exhaust and then work on removing or unbolting the drive shaft from the diff. We may be able to just keep everything floating up there, just enough for us to remove the drive shaft from the transmission. If not, then we'll go ahead and remove the rest of the exhaust. But we're gonna give that a shot first. A couple less steps involved and less hardware to break or have to torch and easy out. All right, so as you can see, my good people, the exhaust clamps back here are completely rotted. This is pretty common, especially in a car that sees assault or snow. So I'm really just hoping these break. I'm gonna humor myself and try to undo the nuts, but more than likely we'll end up cutting them off. I have a 17mm socket, which fits okay, and a 16 as well. I wish I could tell you what these were originally. They are so far gone, but we're just gonna zap them off with the impact, or break it off with the impact and see what happens. And now it's just gonna be a matter of working it off. I have Ethan up on the other side holding the end that we unbolted from the cats. I'm just gonna hammer this off to one side and then it should be able to slip over. We can drop this pipe and then hammer it off the rest of the way. All right, now that we have this one center section off, if you were lucky enough to get the 312s on your passenger side off, you should have 2 of these. For now, we're gonna leave that passenger side one on like I mentioned. We're gonna move on with the rest of the exhaust, starting by removing the hangers. I'm gonna leave this brace in here for now just to kind of keep these side of the pipes from falling. We'll work this clamp off so that it frees up from that center section. Then we have about 3 hangers in the back that we're gonna undo, and we should be able to drop the whole rear section, giving us more access to the drive shaft as well as the center support bearing, which we're gonna wanna undo once we go to drop the drive shaft. At that point, this center clamp is pretty well off the midsection, so once we drop the rear section, it should come out with it. Again, for now, I'm gonna keep this brace in here, but let's go ahead and work on undoing the 3 hangers in the back. All right, over here we have one hanger that holds the center section of our rear section of the muffler. You can either choose to undo the rubber bushing around the hanger or unbolt 2 13mm bolts that attach the whole hanger to the bottom of the car. We're gonna go that route and just unbolt them. So we have two 13mm bolts. Just going to take the electric impact and zap them out. All right, and now with those done, we can hop over to the back, and we have a couple more 13s, one on each muffler end. Over on the passenger side, we have one more hanger. We're also going to zap out the 13mm bolt that holds that in place. There's one. We have a screw jack holding this side. Now let's over to the other side. Then we have two more 13s over here for this middle portion. Now we have all the hangers undone. We can go ahead and remove the whole rear section. Ethan's going to remove the screw jack. I still have that center brace holding the front half of this rear section on the car so it wouldn't fall all the way down. And then together the two of us will pull this out. All right, my good people, now that the exhaust or the rear half is out of our way, we're gonna work on removing the drive shaft. To start, we have 6 M10 triple square bolts that bolt the rear of the drive shaft to the diff. Before we pull it off, I'm gonna take a paint pen and just mark the location of the flange relative to the diff. That way, when we put it back together, everything's kind of lined up and happy. Now we're gonna go ahead and just zap these M10s out with the Milwaukee. Hopefully this is strong enough to zap them out. We don't need to counter hold anything. All right, with the rear 6 M10 bolts undone, the next step is going to be to undo the front half of the drive shaft. I'm saving the center support for last, so A, it kind of holds everything in place, and B, we have control over the drive shaft once that is undone. If we undo the center support now, everything's going to be sagging, so we want to avoid that. We have an Oerlikon style clamp here that we're going to undo. You can use something like a right angle pick or maybe a tiny flathead screwdriver, something to just break the clamp free. Just try not to pierce the boot, as that stays with the drive shaft. Last thing you want to do is put windows in your drive shaft. Once you pry it up a little bit, then you can kind of manipulate the whole thing and unlock it. We have a new one of these as well. These are basically one-time use, especially the way I took this one apart. It's a 36mm Oerlikon clamp. We have it listed in the description below for you good people. Now make sure this boot will slide back when you pull the back of the drive shaft out and drop everything. So sometimes they stick a little bit to the end of the flange here from rust. Now we have that undone. Let's work on removing that center brace, the shield, and then we can undo our center support bearing. All right, we have 4 16mm bolts that hold this cross brace in place. We're gonna go ahead and zap those out now. Now we have that undone, we want to remove the shield, which is held in by 4 10mm fasteners. We have a plastic and metal one on each side. So we'll just go ahead and zap those out now. All right, now that we have those 4 undone, we should be able to drop this shield. All right, now that this is off and all over me, let's go ahead and set the shield to the side. Now we have 2 13mm bolts to remove that hold the center support in place. So at this point, my good people, we have the center support undone. We're still having it held on by one of the 13mm bolts. What issue we're having right now is the CV joint portion of the drive shaft is seized onto the differential flange. So we're just been hitting it with some penetrating fluid, letting it soak, and hoping that after a little bit of soaking, we can go ahead and get it off. So we're gonna work on that so that then we can lower it and either have someone hold it for us or set it on a screw jack so then we can go up front and disconnect it from the transmission side of things. We're gonna need that front and back motion to undo it from the front. As you saw, the last thing that ended up allowing us to remove it or free it up was a long pry bar. There's a tiny ridge on the inside of the CV here, and literally just prying at it while someone else rotated the wheel to spin the drive shaft and the differential was what allowed us to work our way around and free that up. So now that that's undone, our center support bearing's undone, we're going to lower the drive shaft down and gently pull it out from the transmission side, which we already started undoing that circlip. So we'll give you kind of a broad view of what we're doing here, and it's just going to be this coming out as one. All right, my good people, now with the drive shaft out, the next step is going to be to get ready to remove the transmission. In order to do that, we must remove this cover here. This is going to be covering the clutch module bolts that bolted to the engine side of things. Moving over to the right of the module by the Getrag logo here, we have a speed sensor or crank position sensor, call it what you like, that we need to disconnect as well. On the inboard side, on the engine side of things, there's a small locking tab that you need to release. in order to be able to unplug it. These usually just pull down. We'll show you a better look at that once we get it out. There we go. Once the lock comes out, then we can just unplug it by pushing on the tab. Here's a better look at that lock. When it's in the vehicle, this gray tab is all the way up. And then with the pick, I just pulled it down, then you press it to release the connector. While we're here, we're also gonna go ahead and disconnect the power steering rack or the electronic rack so we can just move this harness out of our way. Similar to that speed sensor, these also have a locking tab. Same thing, you just undo these tabs gently, push them back, push on the tab itself, and then just wrestle them off. These are some big connectors, so they may be fighting you if they've never been off before. There we go. And we're also gonna go ahead and undo these other two connectors right here. This last one, the locking tab, is on the inside, right up against the subframe portion. You won't be able to see it very well, but you can get a pick in here just to unlock it. There's a couple clips that hold this harness on the transmission. We're gonna unclip it from the steering rack and let this one live here. We have another metal clip up here. Following the harness, we have one more up here to undo. And then for now, we'll live with this here. We'll just tuck it away. We're gonna come back to it once we lower the transmission. While I have you here, my good people, we're gonna go ahead and disconnect our steering shaft. It is super important when you do this step that no one touches the steering wheel inside the car. Otherwise, you will damage the clock spring. So literally, forget about the inside of the car. Don't even look at it. As once this is reattached again, no problem. But for as long as it's detached from the electronic rack, do not look at the steering wheel. Do not move it. Do not touch it. You can see how this is flat bottomed. It's only going to go one way. And then just push the rod all the way up into the exhaust side of things and forget about it. Now we have that undone. The next thing we're going to work on right now is to undo the 6 16mm 12-point bolts that hold the clutch module to the engine side of things. So using a combination of a 12-point wrench and maybe a screwdriver or pry bar here by the speed sensor, we'll use that to counter hold the flywheel, if you will, as we rotate the engine, and we'll use that to rotate it as well. There is a special Volkswagen tool that you can use to lock the crank pulley in the front and counter hold from there. For those of you that do not want to do the screwdriver trick, CTA 1412 is a tool needed to rotate the crank assembly with a ratchet. All right, my good people, at this point, we're gonna work on rotating the assembly here as we get to the clutch module bolts. Again, those are 16mm 12 points. You wanna make sure when you're rotating, whether you're doing it by the crank or you're doing it here by the flywheel, that you're rotating the engine clockwise or the way that it runs. So we're just gonna go ahead and do that until we have access to the next clutch module bolt. All right, here's the first one. My goal is to just center that as best as possible so that I have enough room to get my wrench on here and work that puppy off. While we do that, we're gonna counter hold the crank pulley in the front, and we're just gonna slowly work that off. Once you break it free, it'll come out the rest of the way by hand. These are being replaced, of course, so please do not save these and reuse them. They are one-time use. And now we're simply gonna go ahead and just repeat the same step for the remaining 5. All right, gang, next on the list, we have 3 16mm 12 points that we're gonna remove while we're down here. Using a 16mm 12 point on a 3/8 drive ratchet, we're gonna go ahead and just break them free. These can technically be reused once more if it's the first time they're coming out. However, I recommend you just replace them every single time you have this apart. It's not worth risking damaging your transmission over a couple dollar bolt or causing them to break. One thing to note, these are oftentimes different lengths, even though they have the same size head. So I would recommend you either draw yourself a little cardboard diagram or number them however you want. You can number them 1, transmission 1, 2, transmission 2, 3. You get the idea. I'm just gonna stick these in a piece of cardboard and use that as my guide. So with those undone, I'm just gonna use the electric ratchet to zap them out, and then we'll put them on our cardboard and move on. All right, while we are down in this area, we're gonna change gears and move a little bit over to the driver's side. We have an exhaust support bracket here that has a rubber bushing as well as a spring. This is gonna be right by the steering shaft. On the spring side, we're simply gonna loosen the bolt. We're not gonna remove it. And then on the lower half, on the bushing side, we're gonna remove this bolt in full, and then we're just gonna rotate these out of our way. So we'll do the driver's side first, and then we'll hop over to the passenger side and do the exact same thing. Now we can go ahead and remove this lower 13 in full. Up top, using a 13mm wrench and ratchet combo, you're gonna wanna loosen this top bolt by the spring until it's almost reached the back of the nut. So just before it completely exits the nut, you're gonna leave a little bit of threads on there, but we're not gonna remove it in full. That is gonna allow enough play for this rubber bushing to slide out of the transmission and just hang off to the side. There we go. You just pop this sucker out of that tab, slide it back, and go ahead and do the same thing on the passenger side. On this side, we're using a stubby 13 to kind of hold the nut on the back. It's a bit of a tight spot against the cap. But same thing, we're gonna loosen it up as much as possible. All right, my good people, next we're gonna work on undoing our slave cylinder. It's held in by one triple square M10 bolt. If you follow the hard line back, you will notice it is also held in by this small rubber grommet on this tab that comes off of the transmission. Once you undo the M10 bolt, we're gonna slide that grommet off, and that will allow us to move the slave cylinder around and zip tie it off to the side. So M10 triple square. All right, and then with that, we should be able to just move this a bit. All right, before we go any further, now we can go ahead and undo that rubber grommet so we can free up our hard line. And for that, we're simply gonna push up, and that's gonna free up the line. And now we can just pull the slave cylinder straight back. Whatever you do, make sure you do not press the clutch pedal at all while this is out. Otherwise, you will damage the slave cylinder, and then you'll have to replace it. Bleed the whole system, will be the whole thing. So go ahead and grab this, set it somewhere to the side, and just zip tie it off if possible. I'm gonna go ahead and do that now. All right, now that we have our slave cylinder undone, the next thing on our laundry list is gonna be to undo this nut that secures our gear selector to the transmission. For that, we have a 13mm nut. We're just gonna go ahead and undo. That gear selector only goes on one way, so you don't really have to worry about marking it or anything like that. When you reassemble everything, it's gonna go back on the same way it came off. We're gonna go ahead and undo this clip up top here that will allow this stabilizer bar to free up from the gear selector rod so that it can easily come off the stud here coming out of the transmission. Just using a flathead screwdriver to kind of pry it out. Here's a better shot at that circlip. Make sure you don't lose this. You wanna make sure you hang on to this because you're gonna need it later. But with that undone, this top stabilizer bar just pops up. And now this arm is a lot more free. There is a special puller for that bar to come off. But if you do not have one, you can very, very, very gently pry it off. And with that, that is the gear selector free, so it's gonna make life a little bit easier. Over here on the left-hand side, we have two 18mm 12-point bell housing bolts that we're gonna work on removing as well. We have one that sits right above both of them sit right above the axle flange here. So we're gonna start with the lower one first. An 18 on a 5-inch extension. And same thing, we're gonna put this one in our little diagram that we made out of cardboard, just so we know what goes where. So when we replace the hardware, we can match them up and put them in the right way. For the next 18 12-point, you may need to bend the tab up a bit that holds the harness in place. Just use a pry bar, give it a slight bend, and then you have room to get your socket and extension in there. So at this point, we have the lower bell housing bolts off, we have the slave off, we have the gear selector rod off. We have these two bell housing bolts right above the axle. Those were the 18 12-points. What we're gonna go ahead and do now is we're gonna work on lowering this cross member here that holds our transmission up in the car. We have 4 triple squares that we're gonna lower using a screw jack or floor jack. We're gonna support it from the back. We're not gonna get the transmission jack in just yet. The goal here is gonna be to lower this a bit so we can work on undoing. There's an electronic connector up there. We have a couple 13mm bolts to remove so then we can access the rest of the bell housing bolts. While we have this lowered as well, we're gonna take advantage of that little bit of drop and work on removing our axles and our shields that are in place here. So we'll do all that. But for now, let's grab our screw jack and we'll remove these triple squares and get to it. We have 4 M12s that hold this cross member in place. We have our screw jack on the rear end of the transmission, not on the shaft, but on the transmission body itself, just taking up any tension. We're going to zap out the 4 M12s, and then we're going to lower this so we can access everything up on top. You're not going to want to lower it any more than about 80 to 100 millimeters. Any more than that, and you can risk damaging stuff inside the engine bay. So just be mindful of that when you're lowering everything. We have an M12 on our impact. We're just going to go ahead and zap all 4 of these out. Now we have those 4 undone. We can go ahead and lower this down a bit. The goal here is to be able to access the bell housing bolts up top, give us a little bit more room for the axles and axle shield hardware, which is going to be the toughest thing to get next, as well as so we can access our electrical connector and anything else that's up here. At this point, this is good for how much we're going to lower it. Now we're going to go ahead and before we climb up top, let's go ahead and take care of our axles now. So we'll start by removing the shields above them that are held in by a couple hex bolts, and then we're going to zap out the axle bolts. So let's do that next. All right, on the driver's side, we're going to start with the heat shield over the axle. More easily accessible towards the rear, we have 2 6mm hex bolts. The third one is up top, which is a little bit harder to get, but we'll start with these 2 first. Make sure that bit is in all the way. I'm using an extension with a swivel joint to just kind of help everything. This top one is a real pain in the butt. Couple swivels and extensions, you can get to it. Small hands do help a lot. All right, we have 3 more on the passenger side. Same deal, impossible to get to, my good people, but you can do it. It's going to be mostly by feel. The first one's always really easy, and then it's the other top ones that are pain in the butt. And where the screwdriver is pointing right now, a little bit hard to see, but that's where the 3rd bolt is. It's really close to that shield and the upright on the subframe. So a little bit tight. You're not going to be able to see it, but you definitely will be able to get to it. All right, now with that last terrible 6mm hex bolt out, we're going to go ahead and pull the shield out. It took a combination of a 1/4 inch bit with a 1/4 inch extension and then a 3/8 adapter. It's a mess, to be honest. That's for this last one over here. Once you get that out though, that means both shields are out. Now we can go ahead and focus on undoing the axles. Now we're going to go ahead and undo these 6 axle bolts. Those are M10 bolts. We'll go around and then we'll go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Not critical, but I went ahead and marked the flange on the axle as well as the transmission side, just so that everything kind of goes back the way it came apart. Let's go ahead and do it. Oh, and for these, I highly recommend you use an impact to zap them out. You can use a regular ratchet and extensions, but you're gonna have to counter hold. It can be kind of a bear. So if you can, I recommend zapping them out. If not, use a brake rotor and a screwdriver as your counter hold. They'll be your best friend. Now we have all 6 M10s out. We're just gonna go ahead and pry the flange away from the transmission. And now with that free, we're just gonna go ahead and let this live here for the remainder of the DIY. We're gonna hop over to the driver's side and do the exact same thing. Now we're gonna go ahead and just pry this flange off as well, like we did on the other side. Before we go ahead and undo the bell housing bolts and all that good stuff up top, there's 2 more down here that we need to address. These are front facing, meaning they're coming from the side of the engine towards the transmission. We have a 16mm 12 point that sits right above your electronic steering rack right here. I highly recommend one of these wrenches to get to them, a ratcheting wrench. So we're gonna go ahead and start with that one first, and then we'll do these starter bolts up top. Now we're gonna go ahead and tackle the 16mm 6 point starter bolt from the front. So let's go ahead and zap that out next. You're gonna need an extension and a swivel. It's gonna be your best friend for this bolt up here. Up top on the transmission, we have one more shifter rod that it's bolted to the top of the trans here, right at the end. It's held in by one 13mm bolt. We'll go ahead and zap that out next. Next, we're gonna move up to the right side of the housing. We have a gear indicator sensor that we're gonna unplug. You can see if I rotate this plug around, there is a tab buried underneath the sheathing here. You can feel it more than you can see it. Here's a better view of it. So just a regular electrical connector. Make sure to unplug that and unclip the harness from the transmission. Now we can work on the rest of the bell housing bolts. You may want to consider removing the bar that goes across the top. The stabilizer bar is held in by one 13mm nut, which is located right here. Sometimes it's easier to move that so that you have a better straight shot at the hardware on top of the bell housing. At this point, we've loosened it up enough, I think, that we can just swing it out of our way. Our next thing is going to be to try to tackle those top bell housing bolts. We also have a heater control valve, which we're going to do next before we get to the bolts that's attached to the top of the transmission. So we want to unclip that from the bell housing before we work on anything else. So while I push with one flathead screwdriver, I'm going to try and pull the little locking pin out. Okie dokie, there we go. That's exactly what we want. All right, next we're gonna work on trying to get arguably the hardest bolt, which is gonna be the starter. So we're gonna go ahead and go with that one. We have a lot of extensions here with a 18mm 12-point socket on the end of them. And we're just kind of gonna fish it in and see where it lands. The starter bolt is gonna be located on the right-hand side of the bell housing, and it is located literally up above where the axle flange is. You can't see it looking from the side of the wheel well, but you can feel it. As long as you can find the body of the starter, you can follow that forward and you'll touch the 18mm 12-point that holds it in. So for the bolt following the starter, the route is going to be the same. You're going to route a bunch of extensions on the top of the transmission along with your 18mm 12-point. At that point, it's going to be more of an angle game than anything, using a second person to help you guide the socket onto the bolt. Once you have it on, then you can go ahead and use an impact or an electric ratchet to zap it out. We have two 12-inch 3/8 drive extensions with a swivel extension at the end. All right, now we got the last top two bolts to go. We have the transmission jack situated under the trans along with a screw jack. And I also went ahead and threaded one of the lower bolts in loosely just to kind of hold everything should this want to fall out. All right, my good people, at this point we believe, all of the hardware out of the transmission. Most everything is disconnected. The goal here is to make everything level again. So right now my cross member is level with the bottom of the car, basically as if we were about to bolt it back in. We're gonna put the weight of the transmission on the transmission jack. And then once everything is nice and happy, we're gonna go ahead and separate the trans from the engine by sliding everything back, hopefully an inch or two. And then it's just a matter of lowering the transmission, making sure we're not pulling any electrical harnesses with us or we didn't forget to unplug something. And the most important thing is to make sure that the transmission doesn't tilt off either forward or backwards off of the transmission stand. If you have ratchet straps or something you can secure the transmission around the jack, that would be even better. So now let's just go ahead and work on getting this down. I'm gonna get rid of the screw jack and then we're gonna slide this back and lower it down. And that does it for the transmission removal portion of this DIY. We've split this video up into two parts to make it easier to use as a guide if you're tackling this job at home. Be sure to follow along in part 2 where we install the new clutch and flywheel and reassemble the car.